Noam Chomsky's Deterring Democracy, 1991, presents a comprehensive critique of U.S. foreign policy, focusing on how the United States, despite its rhetoric about promoting democracy and freedom, has often acted to suppress these very values both abroad and at home. Chomsky argues that the U.S. government's true objective is to maintain global dominance and protect the interests of its economic and political elite, often at the expense of democratic principles and human rights. Deterring Democracy is divided into several sections, each dealing with different aspects of U.S. foreign policy and its implications. Chomsky begins by examining the ideological underpinnings of U.S. policy, arguing that American leaders have consistently pursued a strategy of global control under the guise of spreading democracy. He then provides detailed case studies of U.S. interventions in various parts of the world, demonstrating how these actions have frequently undermined democratic movements and supported authoritarian regimes. Chomsky also discusses the role of the media and intellectuals in supporting U.S. policy, often by promoting narratives that justify intervention and suppress dissenting voices. Chomsky begins by challenging the notion that the United States is fundamentally committed to democracy. He argues that the primary goal of U.S. foreign policy is to maintain a global environment conducive to the interests of American corporations and the political elite. This requires a stable international order where U.S. influence is unchallenged, and any movement that threatens this hegemony, whether it be socialist, nationalist, or democratic, is seen as a threat. Chomsky traces this ideological stance back to the early 20th century, citing examples such as U.S. involvement in Latin America, where efforts to establish independent, democratic governments were often met with military intervention or covert operations designed to install compliant regimes. He argues that the U.S. has consistently favored stability over democracy, where stability means the preservation of a global order favorable to American interests. One of the key strengths of Deterring Democracy is Chomsky's use of detailed case studies to support his arguments. He examines U.S. involvement in several regions, including Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, to demonstrate how the U.S. has acted to suppress democracy and support authoritarian regimes. Chomsky dedicates significant attention to U.S. actions in Latin America, a region where American influence has been particularly pronounced. He discusses the U.S.-backed coup in Guatemala in 1954, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz, who had implemented land reforms that threatened U.S. business interests, particularly those of the United Fruit Company. The U.S. supported the coup under the pretext of combating communism, but Chomsky argues that the real motivation was to protect corporate interests and prevent the rise of a government that might serve as a model for other countries in the region. Another key example is U.S. support for the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. After the 1973 coup that ousted the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende, the U.S. provided extensive aid to Pinochet's regime, Despite its brutal human rights abuses, Chomsky argues that the U.S. supported Pinochet, not because of his commitment to democracy, but because he implemented economic policies that aligned with U.S. interests and ensured that Chile remained a reliable ally in the Cold War. Chomsky also examines U.S. intervention in Southeast Asia, focusing on the Vietnam War as a particularly egregious example of how the U.S. undermined democracy in the name of combating communism. He argues that the U.S. intervention in Vietnam was driven by the desire to prevent the spread of a nationalist movement that sought to create an independent, unified Vietnam, free from foreign domination. Chomsky points out that the U.S. consistently supported the South Vietnamese government, despite its lack of democratic legitimacy and its reliance on repression and violence to maintain power. The U.S. justified its intervention by claiming it was defending democracy, but Chomsky argues that the real goal was to prevent the emergence of a government in Vietnam that could serve as a model for other countries in the region. The Middle East is another region where Chomsky highlights the contradictions in U.S. foreign policy. He argues that U.S. support for authoritarian regimes in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, is driven by the need to maintain control over the region's vast oil resources. Chomsky points out that while the U.S. often speaks about promoting democracy in the Middle East, its actions consistently support regimes that suppress democratic movements and maintain policies favorable to U.S. economic interests. Chomsky also discusses the U.S. relationship with Israel, arguing that U.S. support for Israeli policies, including the occupation of Palestinian territories, is motivated by strategic interests, rather than a genuine commitment to democracy or human rights. He suggests that the U.S. sees Israel as a reliable ally in a volatile region and is willing to overlook its violations of international law to maintain this relationship. In the context of Eastern Europe, Chomsky examines the U.S. response to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent transition to democracy in the region. He argues that while the U.S. publicly supported the democratization of Eastern Europe, its primary concern was ensuring that the new governments would adopt economic policies aligned with Western interests, particularly those of the U.S. Chomsky criticizes the way in which the U.S. pushed for rapid market reforms in Eastern Europe, often at the expense of social stability and democratic development. He suggests that the U.S. was more interested in opening up new markets for American corporations and ensuring that the region remained within the Western sphere of influence than in genuinely supporting democratic governance. A significant portion of Deterring Democracy is devoted to analyzing the role of the media and intellectuals in supporting U.S. foreign policy. Chomsky argues that the media in democratic societies functions as a propaganda system, promoting the interests of the elite while marginalizing dissenting voices. Chomsky's critique of the media builds on the ideas he developed in Manufacturing Consent. He argues that the media serves to manufacture consent for U.S. foreign policy by presenting a narrow range of debate, excluding perspectives that challenge the dominant narrative. framing issues in ways that support the interests of the state and corporate power. For example, during the Vietnam War, the media largely accepted the government's justification for the war and failed to adequately report on the widespread opposition to the war in Vietnam and the United States. Chomsky also critiques the role of intellectuals, who he argues often serve as apologists for U.S. policy. He suggests that many intellectuals, particularly those in academia and the think tank world, are co-opted by the state and use their expertise to justify and legitimize U.S. actions. This, according to Chomsky, creates an illusion of informed debate while ensuring that the dominant narrative remains unchallenged. In addition to his critique of U.S. foreign policy, Chomsky also examines the domestic implications of the U.S. strategy of deterring democracy. He argues that the same mechanisms used to control foreign populations are also applied domestically to suppress dissent and maintain control over the American population. Chomsky suggests that the U.S. government uses a combination of propaganda, surveillance, and repression to control domestic dissent and ensure that the public remains compliant. He discusses the role of the FBI and other intelligence agencies in monitoring and disrupting political movements that challenge the status quo, such as the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and labor unions. Chomsky also critiques the economic policies that have led to increasing inequality and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small elite. He argues that these policies are designed to maintain control over the population by creating a situation where a large portion of the population is economically vulnerable and thus less likely to challenge the system. Deterring democracy is a scathing critique of U.S. foreign policy and the ways in which the United States has acted to suppress democracy and maintain its global dominance. Chomsky's analysis challenges the conventional narrative that the U.S. is a force for good in the world, showing instead how its actions have often undermined democratic movements and supported authoritarian regimes. The book also provides a critical examination of the role of the media and intellectuals in supporting U.S. policy, arguing that these institutions function as instruments of propaganda that serve to manufacture consent for the actions of the elite. Chomsky's critique extends to the domestic implications of this strategy, highlighting how the same mechanisms used to control foreign populations are also applied at home to suppress dissent and maintain control over the American population. Deterring democracy remains a relevant and influential work, particularly in an era where U.S. foreign policy continues to play a dominant role on the global stage. Chomsky's insights into the ways in which democracy is undermined by those who claim to promote it offer a valuable framework for understanding the complexities of global politics and the challenges of creating a truly democratic world order.